Okay, it's 7 o'clock, so we can begin. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Well, thank you for coming. This is our last session. And what I'd like to do is there's lots of literature coming out now about the consequences of the Reformation. And so I would like to look at some of the consequences, some of the way that it has affected our culture and our institutions, especially in the Western world, but further than that as well, and kind of see how this impacts the kind of world that we have inherited from the 16th century. Before I begin, are there any questions that anyone has, or any challenges or anything? Or shall we just begin? Okay. The first thing is, first of all, there is a book by historian Brad Gregory, and it's called The Unintended Consequences of the Protestant Reformation. It was on the Best History Book Awards in the country, it's good. My critique of it is that he acts like everything he put in it was a new discovery, which it really isn't. It's the idea of the reflection upon these consequences have been going around for a very long time. And there's very different interpretations also along the way. But the first thing that I would like to address is that there was, in the 16th century, under the authority of Luther and those who were close to him, a transfer of authority from the realm of the clerical to the local civil governments. Now, this was not so radical at the time that it was transpiring, because it was a Christian community, the civil society, and this is the thing that's in the modern day it's hard to get our minds wrapped around, that in a society where everybody, if not a real true believer, at least was affiliated with the church and went to church and celebrated holy days and so forth, that whether the authority was with the priests or the bishops, or whether it was with the local civil governments, was not a radical transfer of authority, because it was still being governed within the Christian community. Now, some of the things that were transferred, for instance, poor relief. Every parish used to have what they called a common chest, and from that, various things within the community were paid for. One of the things that was involved in the common chest was poor relief. And so the welfare systems came out of free will offerings and contributions that were possessed within the local parish communities. What happened was, when we had a changeover from Roman Catholic to evangelical maintenance of the parishes, there were differences that surfaced, and one of them was who were the poor. And they made a distinction. The Catholics gave indiscriminately, and so the Protestants said that was kind of irresponsible. It helped to support beggars. And we saw the issue with beggars, that we had a population growth that outstripped the economic and the political and social capacity of the society to integrate them into any way, and so they became kind of marginalized and nuisances as far as the cities were concerned. Many of them would not allow beggars inside the city walls, so they all closed the city walls at night to keep the beggars out and so forth. The Catholics, through the common chest, the poor chest, what they did was anyone who came for help, they gave help. The Protestant says that's irresponsible. And there was a movement in England also. In Germany they called them the Hausarme. And in England they called them the worthy poor. And so they set up criteria for the distribution of worthy funds. And they took that away from the local parish, and it went to the city councils who maintained the poor chest. In other words, clergy did not have access to the money that was given to the poor chest. It went to the city councils. And as a matter of fact, in some cases, the city councils then, because of the restricted distribution, oftentimes had money left over in the poor chests. And that was the beginning of kind of like what we would call maybe credit unions or savings banks, that they would then loan the extra money in the poor chest and charge interest on it. So if you went through the bookkeeping, you had more money in the chest than you had at the end of the year than you had in the beginning, despite the distributions. And what that was interest payments. So kind of more from a purely charitable reality into something that was controlled by the civil government. Also, the clergy were then paid by the local civil governments. They did not derive their livelihood from stipends or donations or stove fees or anything like that. They had to turn over what they were given to the city, and the city would then reimburse and pay them. Education also switched over from the church to the civil government. And actually, Martin Luther's kind of right-hand man, administrative man, Johannes Bugenhagen, was the one in charge of the administrative structures of the evangelical churches in the cities of northern Germany. And he is the one that set up the educational system. The educational system became the responsibility then of the civil government, and not of the church or the religious communities who had sustained it, like the Brethren of the Common Life. Educationally, what happened is that with the destruction of the female monasteries and convents, they cut off higher education for women, but they believed in universal literacy at what we would call a grade school level. So, since there was no church, except the local communities, because the universal church had been dismantled, the Christian community was governed by civil authority alone. Again, it's not a serious problem because the civil governments were made up of the local members of the church. That this was true in Lutheranism, and this was certainly true in Calvinism as well. And people say, well, you know, the Puritans set up a theocracy, meaning governed by the clergy. That's not true. They were governed by lay people, but the lay people were members of the local communities. And so it was not kind of a fracturing of the communal structure, but it was a fracturing of the universal structure. What happened then in this, and this is where you get into Gregory's book on unintended consequences, but also what has been traced for centuries in the unpacking of all this information, was that what happened then when the Enlightenment came? What happened then when rationalism came? The civil governments were no longer necessarily members of the ecclesial communities that existed in the various cities and towns and provinces and so forth of Germany, of the Low Countries eventually, and parts of France and Switzerland and so forth. What happened was, what we were using our terminology, civil governments began to be secularized. They began to be secularized by the Enlightenment, by rationalism, by the fallout of the Reformation. And so
what happened then is that many of the evangelical churches were being tied more closely to secular governments and no longer really Christian governments within their local community. The tension there created a lot of splintering in the evangelical movement, and many who refused to submit to civil authority then became like the Anabaptists and the Mennonites and so many of the others, who then had to migrate. They could not stay in their home territories. Many of them ended up in Russia, which was much more tolerant of the sects than the Western Europe was, and eventually many of them in this country and in Canada as well. I can't remember his name, but one of our vice presidential candidates, obviously didn't get elected, I don't remember who was a candidate for, but he was a member, he was a Schwenkfeldian from Pennsylvania, and then there were the Hooterites from North Dakota and so forth. So a lot of these Anabaptist groups, Mennonites, the radical Mennonites, the Old Order Amish and so forth, found refuge from Russia over into our country as well. So we had then the problem of the secularization of authority within the Christian community. And we see this happen very, very dramatically in England under Queen Elizabeth. When Elizabeth found tremendous resistance to the English Reformation in the countryside, there's a book, Eamon Duffy, called The Stripping of the Altars, and it's a story of the transition, of the destruction of the monasteries, the transition, and so forth. So Elizabeth was very, very demanding that the Reformation in England not so destroy the common sense of religion in the beginning that would cause revolution. And so what she said was, I do not want to open windows into men's souls. In other words, I don't care what they believe. But the church had better look like the Catholic Church and be supportive of my government. And so that was really the tremendous thrust of the Anglican Church, the Episcopalian Church, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth into James. The two Charleses were a little bit different, but that was involved in the Civil War, when the Puritans would not accept that. And also, many of them, therefore, came to this country. So the tensions, then, within Protestant society and secular government exacerbated. What happened was many of the Protestant churches, like the Episcopalians, were still obedient to the crown. And so in that they invested their authority in the crown, as Henry VIII had wanted them to do. And so as the English government secularized more and more, and the king or the queen became less of an actual ruler and more of a parliamentary consultant and figurehead, much within the Church of England also began to secularize, because that was the seat of their authority. The same thing was true with many of the mainstream churches in this country, beginning as they did to be loyal to their local civil governments, which were Christian. They then followed them. The one exception to that, interestingly enough, in American history, is the Methodist Church, which was founded basically as a charismatic movement from the Church of England in the 1700s. And the Methodists remained much of American history up until the 20th century as the moral kind of opposition of the secular government. They did not capitulate. They were the abolitionists. They were the temperance people. They were the ones who advocated, for the 14th Amendment and so forth. They had a very powerful moral influence in the United States up until the collapse, basically, of the moral synthesis in this country after the First or the Second World War. Another consequence then, too, besides the secularization of authority in the Christian church, another was, interestingly enough, too, as a footnote to that, as we, as Catholics, were attempting to integrate into American society, and have opportunity, we began to follow that same pattern. You know, I remember a Catholic school report card, Pro Deo et Patria, for God and the fatherland, the country, you know. And we remember how relieved when John Kennedy said his religion would not interfere with him being president of the United States. It wouldn't mean anything to him. It was a separate category. We thought, well, that's great, now he can get elected and blah, blah, blah. It turned out to have disastrous consequences for us because it was so alien, so foreign to the very essence of who we were and how we had traveled through the last 1,000 years. So, at any rate, the enmity between the Roman Catholic Church and the secular movements, there is a very interesting book called Out of Revolution, the autobiography of Western man, by a man by the name of Eugen Rosenstock Hussey, not necessarily a household name. But basically, it's I think 800 pages. What he says, his thesis is, and this is a fascinating piece, might be, there's a lot of truth in it, how encompassing it really is. But he wrote the book in 1938, and he was a German. So he knew what lay on the horizon. But he also knew what had been going on between Rome and the Third Reich. He remembered, of course, Pius XI's encyclical Membrennen Sorge, in which he condemned Nazism and condemned the anti-Semitic campaign that Hitler had, and so forth. But basically his thesis was that the last 1,000 years of Western civilization has been a dramatic story of the struggle between Roman Catholicism and secularism. Now, Rosenstock Hussey was a Jew who had converted to Lutheranism. But this is how he saw the development of Western society. And so then he went back, he started with the Bolshevik Revolution, and went back through all of the revolutions in this country, in Europe, back into the end of the 11th century. In the revolution of Gregory VII, as he tried to wrest the control of the church back from the Emperor Henry IV. Fascinating book. He knows too much, so there's too much in it. And it gets frustrating if you're not particularly familiar with this. It's like, anyways. But it's interesting. And who knows? But then there's another consequence of the Reformation. Besides this breaking down of the idea of any kind of universal government or any kind of independent autonomy of the church as an institution over and against civil governments, huge. The next thing was the question of human nature. Heinz Schilling, who wrote the book, the most modern book, Martin Luther, Rebel in an Age of Upheaval, talks about, in a way, the end of universalism. Humanity was no longer one by nature, as Catholicism had always maintained, that we came forth, what makes us human is that through creation, we participate to some degree in the divine being. So all humanity has an integral relationship with God. Original sin, according to Augustine and according to Scripture, damaged that primordial relationship and restricted our freedom and our goodness, but it did not destroy it. We still had elements of goodness and elements of freedom within us that enabled us to cooperate with grace and so be participants with God in our salvation. That no longer held, because if human nature was depraved, then the only thing which humanity was known for as something good was by religious confession. So humanity was not known through the nature created by God, but by religious choices and religious ideologies in their lives, which meant that it was intolerable for those who were saved to somehow or other positively interact with those who were damned. And this had consequences everywhere. For instance, and it was the Calvinists who came here, but you know, when we read our history books, at least, so long ago, they were all written with a British prejudice. The British hated the Spanish, and everything that we got in American history was from a British perspective. And so in settling in the New World, the English were the enlightened ones, and the Spanish were the evil, dark villains. Well, that's not exactly true. The Spanish certainly were driven by greed, many of them. But the vast forces of missionaries, as we talked about the last time, was to baptize as many as possible in preparation for the second coming of Christ. The Franciscans especially, but also the Jesuits, and especially Francis Xavier and the Fathers. But anyways, what now happened was the saved, there was nothing they could do with those who were not saved. There was no Protestant missionary activity until the 19th century, actually. Because why would you be a missionary? I mean, Protestantism has changed over the centuries, of course it has. And there's many different manifestations and expressions of it. But we're talking about the 16th century realities. So, when, for instance, the Calvinists came to this country, when the Spanish came, they baptized, they exploited, eventually they married, and they created kind of a whole new race of people. It's the mestizo. In the North, with Calvinists, that's not what happened. Because the Indians were not, obviously, of the elect. They had no civil rights. So they could not be integrated into society. And they had no rights within the society. And so we were entitled to what they had. We were entitled to that. And the Indians were not the saintly, pure, natural people either. There was great horror on both sides in the settlement of this country. The books by Alan Eckert. Have you ever read those?
Right here.
Oh, I mean, there's a lot of them. They're very long and they're horrifying. They're so gruesome. But you get through with it one year. You got strong stuff. And it worked in both directions. But the fact of the matter is that there was never any thought whatsoever of, in some way or other, of integrating them into elect society. And so they were pushed further and further and further. And we have the sad stories of the Trail of Tears. But much of that's romanticized too. The Trail of Tears, the Cherokees, it was a horrible thing. And the Cherokees were driven out of the Southeast and driven into Oklahoma and so forth. But they took with them their slaves. So, it's not the story of these great people and these bad people. It's a story of humanity, sinful humanity, struggling with its own identity. And in this outcome of the Reformation society, there was no understanding of the universal brotherhood of man. There was no study, there was no sense of that in humanity we were all children of God. In humanity there were the saved and the damned. And the saved had rights, and the damned did not. And in the Northern Hemisphere, during the ages of settlement, that was very much a part of the story of the settlement of our country, Canada, and so forth. So, humanity then became identified by its religious confession, its religious understanding of itself. And that was not subject to the benevolence or possible benevolence in people who were not of the same confession. So at the end of universalism came not only an end of a universal government, not only the end of a universal Christian church, but the end of the universal family of humanity. And Western Europe became radically divided by religious choices and religious ideologies. Protestantism itself broke into multiple confessional communities. So there was no one Christian church or one Christian faith, even among themselves. Luther had started out with a private interpretation of Scripture. He was totally convinced in this private interpretation of Scripture that he alone, this is a bin ich allein der Weise, am I the only one who knows, and his conclusion was yes. And so, if you don't understand Scripture the way that I understand Scripture, you are not guided by the Holy Spirit. And if that's true, then you are an enemy of Christ. Well, when this multiplies and breaks up, because Zwingli didn't interpret the same way Luther did, Calvin didn't interpret the same way Luther did, the Anabaptists didn't, and so forth, the different groups did not, there was great enmity between them. The one thing they had in common was the hatred of us. And so what happened was not only civil wars broke out within Europe, but interreligious wars, confessional wars, wars that took place. Not that there was not war before. Those were dynastic wars. Those were wars between people. But now it was between people who identified themselves with a religious confession. And this is one of the things that brought about the Enlightenment, and one of the things that brought about John Locke's philosophical treatises on government. How do you get, what criteria can you establish for some kind of right to rule that isn't based on confessional religion? How can you do it? Locke's solution was private property. He said nature, not God, bestows private property on a person. And so, if you are an owner, if you are independent, financially, politically independent, socially independent, you have a right to govern. In our country, in the Constitutional Congress, only those people could vote who owned at least a 200 shilling freedom. But it became a more radical thing. For instance, that's why they denied equal civil rights to women. Because women were dependent on their husbands for a livelihood. And because of that, they were not whole persons. They were not free persons. They were not owners of themselves as private property. So they could not have rights. The same way with children, the same way with servants, and the same way with slaves. If I own the slave is not a full person under the law. They are my property, and therefore cannot be free and cannot govern. That was Locke's solution. He wrote the constitutions for North and South Carolina, providing for slavery, the right of private property. These are the same arguments, of course, that are used today in abortion, euthanasia, and so forth. I am my own private property. As Locke said, I create my own person through my consciousness and my experience. The child inside is biologically dependent and therefore not a legal person. Since it adheres and dependent upon my body, I can do with it as I please. It's what Justice Brennan called the penumbra of privacy, the Griswold versus Connecticut case. It's the same way with euthanasia. The person no longer has quality of life, a Lockean term, which means they're not independent. If they're not independent, then upon whom are they dependent? Whoever is taking care of them. They're their property. And they can dispose of them as they please. That's the consequences, and that's the legal reality of how we've gotten all this stuff in the 20th century. We've overcome the women thing, we've overcome the children thing, we've overcome the servant thing. We don't have slaves anymore, at least not legally or officially. And, but we still have this notion that I am my own possessor of my own self as my own private property, and anything that impinges upon that, I can dispose of at will. Anyways, that was something that was a response to the wars of religion in Europe, where it wasn't just Catholics against an undefined Protestant mass. It was Protestants against each other and all of them against us. And so the wars of religion were so destructive, but it was the direct result of the destruction of a sense of universality, where there was one church, one human race, and so forth. So that's a consequence also. Again, another notion, the whole understanding of church itself was disappeared. And it's really kind of, again, interesting that although in the beginning they spoke of the church, eventually they dropped that. And here's Romano Guardini, who was a German theologian with that name, at the University of Munich. And he was talking about his own religious experience as a young man coming to the university. And he says, and so thus I scanned more than 50 years of theoretical study and personal exchange, and the fact of Protestantism's vital relationship to sacred scripture was once again emphatically clear to me. Yet equally clear was the fact that Protestantism's relationship to church was very indefinite. As a matter of fact, as often as I've heard the word church employed in a Protestant context, I have never been able to determine its precise connotation. At the turn of the century, I recall the period well, since I was a student, and that's the last century, Protestants refrained whenever possible from all allusion to the concept of church. Change occurred, however, particularly during the years of the struggle against National Socialism. The Protestant concept of church took on a new meaning. It became the battle cry against a totalitarian state which had appropriated to itself the title of sole society among men. Protestants objected by an assertion of the church's right to exist. And there I found a living communal spirit. However, when considered, Protestantism's manifold groups and diversity in dogma raised the question, what precisely is meant by church? So I formed the conclusion that the Protestants had no fundamental church relationship. Naturally, such an assumption may be unjust, but rather than spend the time debating the point, I prefer to explain what the church means, how my relationship to it is formed the role of the church in my religious life. So the idea of a church was a universal concept which they found difficulty using. When it became clear that Luther was not in the business of reforming the Roman Catholic Church, but was in the business of creating a new religious community, the word church always had a universal context to it. So they avoided that once it became definitely separated from Rome and when they became separated from each other. The other consequence that came as a result of the change in human nature was something very, very radical and absolutely fascinating. Have any of you ever read the novel Lord of the Flies? Have you ever read that? Well, don't read it in a dark and windy night. But basically what it is the story of a group of young English schoolboys who their plane crashes on an island, and all the adults, the pilot and so forth, are killed. What is left is a group of young English schoolboys, and they turn into barbaric animals by the time it's over. worshiping the pig, which they call the Lord of the Flies. And the Lord of the Flies, translated, is Beelzebub. So it is done. Left unto themselves without the constraints of civilization, they revert to become diabolical creatures. Now, Thomas Hobbes' book is the perfect Protestant novel, taking Protestantism in the terms of the 16th century. And it flows from a political philosophy from a man named Thomas Hobbes, who in the 17th century, he wrote his major political work called Leviathan. And there he proposed a view of human nature and of political order, which is of great interest. He says, the condition of man in nature is a condition of war of everyone against everyone. He continued in the state of nature which precedes the establishment of civil society. There were no arts, no letters, only continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That humanity, without the constructs of civil society, was little less than an animal kingdom. George Orwell, for instance, all of this kind of thing. That we were depraved. And without the constraints, Hobbes' philosophy, political philosophy, therefore said that the citizen must cede their rights to the state to preserve them from the chaos and the destructiveness of human nature. So that this depravity of human nature politically led itself to an acceptance of strong government to which citizens must somehow give their rights, lest they become worshippers of the Lord of the Flies. And Golding's novel was a perfect literary expression of Hobbes' political philosophy. It's interesting that Thomas Hobbes, of course, was English, and that the English church, the Church of England, basically has in its very root very strong Calvinist theology. We do what Elizabeth I wanted us to do. We say, well, gee, they look so much like us, they may be like us. But they're very different than we are in their theological groups, whatever they are socially, I don't know, but in their theological groups, they're Calvinists. And they certainly believe, therefore, in the destructiveness of human nature and in predestination. Much of that, for the sake of good taste, is slighted over in the time of history, and much of it becomes simply a supportive institution to secular government, and also becomes much for us of kind of a way of overcoming Hobbes' philosophy of government by saying, see how civilized we all can be. And after all, what's the difference between us and the old church? Don't we look a lot alike? And of course, we do. And that's what Elizabeth wanted. The alternative to that in the story of the development of Western society was in 18th century France. There was a different approach to human nature and society, and we are familiar with this as well. And it is the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his Social Contract. In that, he says, man was born free and is everywhere in chains. It's exactly the opposite of Hobbes. The chains that Rousseau speaks about, he said that the first encroachment upon human freedom was the establishment of private property. That contrary to the Enlightenment, this again, once you have private property, he says, you have to defend against it. And so your neighbors then become your enemies, and the story of contemporary society is a story of greed and conflict and based on possession of private property. Well, what happened was that became very popular, and it changed our culture observations. But it was more the idea in Rousseau, French, he came from a Catholic tradition. Humanity somehow at its root is good. What makes it bad? The church says sin. Rousseau says property. What happened then was there became this romantic idea. If this is true, then the savages are the good people. And you had this literary type of the noble savage. Huckleberry Finn, The Last of the Mohicans, the romanticization of Indian civilization, un-Christian civilization, the exacerbation of the viciousness and horribleness of the Spanish in South America, with the American Indian. They were the noble ones. Have any of you ever seen the show Apocalypto, the movie, the film? It's worth watching. It's worth watching. Because Gibson takes exactly the opposite approach. But this idea of the noble savage became part and parcel of American literature, became part and parcel of English literature. The story of Robinson Crusoe, for instance. All of these things. The noble savage, the one freed from the shackles of civilization. They were the natural person. They, very basically, in a funny sort of way, this was much more an outgrowth of Catholicism and the idea of the universal good of the human person who is then damaged by the imposition of human sufferings. Freed from human society. So you put the Lord of the Flies up against Social Contract, and you've got two radically different views of humanity. One solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and the other one, the glorious freedom of the savage. These became romantic ideals, and it led us into a romantic age. There was a man in Germany, in Msgr in Germany, and he wrote in 1777. He wrote something. I always say this word because I like it. But he wrote the Osnabrückische Geschichte, and which meant the history of Osnabrück. And anyways, in that he picked up this idea of the noble German peasant who was damaged by the civilization of feudalism and Charlemagne, and that left unto themselves the German peasants were free warrior democratic societies. Civilization came and oppressed them. And so basically what Msgr wanted to say was, get rid of this burden of the French Enlightenment and let the Germans again be free, the noble savages of the forests. Well, this was picked up by the Romantic movement in Germany in the 19th century. And it became a standard part of German literature and drama. And it became also the tool that Hitler used to talk about who the German people were. They had experienced oppression after the First World War, terrible oppression, by England, France, and the United States. And civilization has done this to us. We are the noble people. We are the noble savages of the forests. And we must come together, liberate ourselves from this riffraff, and in some way then, find a way to assert the superiority of the noble savages of the past over this dysfunctional and destructive society. It was a great dramatic narrative. And the art of the Nazi era showed very clearly this idea, the strong farmers and the strong women, and all of this, the great people. And this then became very much a part of the mythology of the Third Reich. It came in this desire. Now, Hitler was a malevolent person. He was probably struck raving mad. And in any other society except one which had been stomped upon badly and unjustly after the First World War, he probably would have run nowhere. But he had a narrative that helped people want to have a different understanding of themselves, that the losers who were exploited by everyone around. And to an extent, temporarily, however, it worked. This then, this radical difference, they also saw, as a matter of fact, they also saw that that the church, the Catholic Church, they began to interpret as the vehicle of civilization, and therefore as the oppressor. And so most of the social revolutions were contrary, were against the forms of Catholicism which they saw as being part of this oppressive civilization. And all of the cultural treasures of the Roman Catholic Church were rejected as being simply signs of oppressiveness from the wicked civilizations. Interesting, but this division between the understanding of humanity, the breakdown of the universal humanity, man, was disastrous for the world, and that still became part and parcel, and still is part and parcel. Those who are heirs to the hatred of Catholicism, the rejection of civilization, and the idealization of kind of the anarchist is part of the fruit of the Hobbesian Rousseauian debate. And in the West, there was a period where Hobbes prevailed, and now there was a period when Rousseau prevailed, but without any kind of overarching civilizing component. The noble savage became the reality. The ones in South America who offered human sacrifices by the hundreds of thousands. The American Indians, many of them, some peaceful like the Hurons, some warlike like the Iroquois. Jean de Brebeuf, the French Jesuit missionary who had moved the Hurons out from Montreal to protect them from French king's order that they would become French before they could be converted to Christianity. He moved them out to protect them, and the Iroquois came. They were no match for the Iroquois. They were killed. Jean de Brebeuf stood, offering his life to God as the Iroquois reached into his chest, pulled out his heart, and it was still beating. He from it. So this is not really the noble savage. You know? So there's fallacies in all of these kinds of thrusts and directions that we go through. The next thing was consequence. There could be no tolerance and no pluralism within the Christian community, and therefore within the state. A society was defined by its religious affiliation. Civil society could not tolerate pluralism without understanding that as sedition. This is where Luther's anti-Semitism comes into play, because he was the one, society must be whole, confessionally whole, because that's what identifies a society, not human nature, but religious confessionalism. So anyone who was not a friend, a believer in the insights of Luther into Scripture, therefore became an enemy of Christ. All dissenters had to be expelled from Lutheran territories. On top of that, also, who were the most egregious non-believers in Jesus Christ? The Jews. And that's where Luther's radical anti-Semitism came from. He demanded, the week he died, he wrote a letter to the electorate demanding that they be banished from the electorate of Saxony. For they were enemies of Christ and therefore enemies of humanity. The whole story of anti-Semitism in Western history is very complicated. There are attempts, of course, to write fairy tale versions of it. James Carroll, in his book Constantine's Sword, is one of the more irresponsible attempts to deal with it. But basically, there was tension, but there was tension between the Jews and the Christians from the very earliest days. Because the Jews had a special privilege from the Roman Empire. They did not have to worship the emperor, and they did not have to offer sacrifice to the emperor. As long as the Christians were Jews and were in the synagogues, they enjoyed the same privilege. As soon as they were expelled from the synagogues, they were exposed to the full fury of Roman law. And that's when the great persecutions began. Obviously, there were hard feelings. And as that happened, there was therefore a very difficult relationship between Jews and Christians, because the Jews in the Christian mind had exposed them to the fury of the Roman Empire and forced them into positions of either apostatizing or dying. Now, when Western Christian society began to recover from the great barbarian invasions, if you're English, there were barbarian invasions. If you're German, they were the wandering of the nations. As soon as they came into the territory of the Roman Empire, when that settled down, then the structure, the political structure that developed in Western Europe was a structure called feudalism. Feudalism simply was a society, a defensive society, held together by religious vows. The vow had to be sworn in the name of Jesus Christ. And the consequence of that is perjury if you violate it, a violation of the first commandment, essentially, taking the name of the Lord in vain. Who could not be trusted? And if those vows were broken, the consequence was chaos and war. Who could not be trusted to take a vow in the name of Jesus Christ who believed they could have helped they broke it? The Jews. And so the Jews were not welcomed, therefore, into feudal society. This is when they bring the Mediterranean and they became the bankers and the merchants. As soon as the year 1000 came and things had settled down, it was the Jewish merchants that began to come north and bring trade and so forth into the northern countries. People were afraid of them. They had never seen them before. They dressed funny and they talked funny. And so they avoided them, stayed away from them. If something bad happened, well, it must be the Jews, you know? So this kind of ancient antagonism became structural in the political life of medieval Europe, so that it was in the water. But a new interpretation of the anti-Semitism came from Luther's understanding that basically they were the enemies of Jesus Christ and therefore the enemies of all believers. And they had to be expelled. Many people have taken this, not Catholic, but secular historians have taken this, linked this up to the racial purity business and the Third Reich and so forth. I don't know if there's connections or not. Many people have said there are, many people have followed, and many people say no, there wasn't. So, but we do know that Luther himself was radically anti-Semitic, and he left a great body of anti-Semitic literature. Finally, of the consequences, there was kind of no openness to transcendence. Religion was of this world, since the human soul was incapable of approaching God because of its depravity. There was no giving of one's life to God in vows, religious life, celibate priesthood, eremitical life. It was all about the existential, the earthly, and the personal. That kind of ancient understanding that there was some kind of communication between the human soul and the divine being, that's sought by the Desert Fathers, that built into the Eastern Church's monastic system. All those, the mystics of our own tradition and so forth. None of that was acceptable. Because religion was basically about personally believing and then trying to live it out in our existential, horizontal lives. There was no notion of giving one's life in service to others, since our lives were of no value, except the value given to them extrinsically by God. And therefore no real accountability in our lives to God or his authority on earth, since we had nothing to do with our own salvation. We are accountable to the book. And that, that I had, when I was in Northern Ireland one time, I had a long conversation with a young man from Belfast, and so far as I could understand what he was saying. And he was hiding out in a local Trappist monastery. He was a Belfast Protestant. And I was talking to him, I said, well, now explain this to me. Here you are hiding out in a Trappist monastery, and you hate Catholics. I said, why are you here? He says, well, because I want to get out of the country. And I said, why do you want to get out? He said, well, because I kill people. I said, all right. So what's the monastery? Well, the monastery will take care of me and they'll get me out of the country. I said, well, so then how can you say you're a saved Christian, if you've been murdering people? I'm saved, it doesn't matter. That's a radical position, and certainly I'm not saying, but I am saying in this hot environment where the ancient took roots in that particular society, this was a mindset. Since I am saved, the Lord is going to take care of me. So what if I kill Catholics? I mean, they're no good anyway. So that was kind of the attitude. I was kind of flabbergasted by that. And I said, well, why are the monks getting, he says, well, because that's the way they think. They don't know. I said, all right, fine. I said, I'm a Catholic priest. Yeah, I know. You're sitting around talking to me, so it's good. And I asked him how he knew the difference. And it was really kind of amusing. But anyways, and finally, there isn't a real hope in this paradigm for the future of humanity. Since nothing changes in us through the ages, it is all the work of God alone as we trudge along the pathways of a lonely world of damnation and darkness, where only some are plucked out of the emptiness by the selective grace of God, who is not our companion, but our master. And I think that in this, obviously, in 20th century, 21st century American Protestantism, we can have all sorts of discussions about whether this is applicable or not applicable. But in the 16th century mindset, which we have been dwelling in, first of all, it's almost impossible for us to imagine a society, where there is one church, one religion, one emperor, one pope, and so forth. It's not part of our experience. And so when we take this stuff and we process it in the 21st century, we're not understanding it for what it really was. We have to go back and see, and then we know where things come from. I doubt very much that a good English Protestant today would say, yep, William Golding's exactly right. If it weren't for the Queen, we'd all be killing each other and worshiping Satan. I doubt very much if they would say that. You know? I doubt very much in this radical person in Northern Ireland who had been radicalized by the politics there. I would very much be surprised if there were large numbers of people who thought it was all right to kill us because after all it didn't sit me, because they were safe. I doubt that that's probably part of the modern landscape, except in places like Belfast, which is now so secularized and probably not there anymore either. But this was, 20 years ago. So when I go through this, it was like the problem with Max Weber's interpretation of predestination that I read in Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism. It is actually probably a study in time and not an authentic commentary on the present world. Nevertheless, these things stir around at the roots of our society. Who would have thought that Roe v. Wade was something that emerged in the 17th century in John Locke's treatise, two treatises on God. And yet it's real. It's an existential phenomenon. It's real. Who would have thought of this whole business of the noble savage somehow or other taking over the whole social structure of 21st century nations? And yet it is. And it is not. Its origin was in the inherent goodness of humanity. But that isn't how it traveled through time. What traveled through time was picked up in the 18th century by the Romantics is that civilization destroyed us as human beings, its own was destroyed. What is that, Antifa or whatever it's called? That's exactly what it is. They have no understanding whatsoever of the history of their people. It's awash in ignorance and sin. But these are the kinds of things that we ponder, that we wonder about. Why are we where we are? There is no doubt, Protestant, Catholic, or Jew, that we are not aware of the fact that much of this has a story to it, and much of it has a beginning. And the understanding of its roots is the first baby step toward trying to find ways to unravel the evil consequences of the time and place and age. That's the best, I think, that we can do. So as we come to the end of this series, first of all, I want to thank you very much for coming and for being faithful through all these weeks. 6 weeks, it's a long time. I want to also say that any of you who are guests here from outside the Catholic community, I thank you for coming and for being kind. And I simply ask that, like in any ecumenical endeavor, the most important thing is understanding of the roots and knowledge of the truth of the situation. None of us come out of this clean and unscathed. But what is it all about? And a key, as far as I am concerned, that we never deal with essentially at the core. The key is the understanding of the human person. Who are we? And what does it matter? And what does it mean? If we can ponder these questions, religiously, politically, socially, philosophically, however, if we can ponder these things, we have something to converse about. If not, it's either a capitulation or what difference does it make? What matter does it make? It's all the same anyway, which it isn't. Do you have any questions? Outrages. There's always outrage in our society. Okay. Well, thank you very, very much. And we won't be... Okay, thanks.